The Great Depression didn't just destroy fortunes and close factories, it created an entire underground economy of bizarre occupations that desperate Americans turned to for survival. From human alarm clocks to children dodging bowling balls for pennies, the 1930s spawned jobs so strange they seem like fiction. In this video, we'll be exploring the weird jobs that were completely normal during America's darkest economic hour. In 1993, when unemployment hit 1 in 4 Americans, desperation birthed an industry that would make modern reality television producers blush with envy. Dance marathons swept the nation like a fever, transforming human endurance into public spectacle. These weren't your typical weekend dance contests. The longest documented marathon stretched an almost incomprehensible 3,780 hours, lasting over 157 days of nearly continuous movement. Imagine shuffling your feet for more than 5 months straight, and you'll begin to understand the depths of Depression-era desperation. The business model was as simple as it was exploitative. Promoters rented large halls, charged admission to gawking audiences, and offered contestants 3 meals a day, a cot during brief rest periods, and the tantalizing promise of cash prizes for those who could outlast their competition. For unemployed workers facing starvation, this deal seemed like salvation. The format was deceptively brutal. Couples danced or shuffled for 45 minutes of every hour, with only 15-minute breaks to collapse, eat, or tend to their deteriorating bodies. What audiences witnessed was nothing short of a human cockfight. Contestants developed a distinctive zombie-like shuffle, barely lifting their feet as exhaustion consumed them. Their eyes grew hollow, their movements mechanical. Some hallucinated from sleep deprivation, others collapsed mid-dance from malnutrition despite the provided meals. Medical emergencies became part of the entertainment as nurses rushed onto the dance floor to revive fallen competitors while the music never stopped playing. These marathons revealed something disturbing about American society during its darkest hour. Audiences paid good money to watch their fellow citizens suffer, finding entertainment in human degradation. Children brought their school lunches to watch the spectacle unfold over weeks. Local newspapers provided daily updates on contestants' conditions like sports scores. The events became community gathering points where depression-weary Americans could witness suffering worse than their own. The exploitation was systematic and calculated. Promoters often rigged contests to maximize drama, secretly providing favored couples with better food or longer rest periods. Some events were fixed entirely, with predetermined winners chosen for their ability to generate audience sympathy or outrage. Medical care was minimal, and serious injuries were treated as unfortunate but acceptable costs of doing business. Eventually, the moral weight of these spectacles became too heavy for society to bear. Religious groups organized protests outside marathon venues. Medical professionals published reports detailing the severe health consequences of prolonged sleep deprivation and physical stress. City councils across the nation began passing ordinances restricting or outright banning dance marathons. The events were increasingly viewed not as harmless entertainment, but as modern gladiatorial combat where poverty forced the desperate to fight for survival, while others watched from comfortable seats. By the late 1930s, changing public tastes and tightening regulations had largely killed the dance marathon craze. The jobs disappeared as quickly as they had emerged, leaving behind only newspaper clippings and a few grainy photographs as evidence of this bizarre chapter in American labor history. The contestants returned to breadlines and street corners, their months of suffering reduced to footnotes in the larger story of economic collapse. But the streets weren't the only place where desperation created opportunity. While some Americans destroyed their bodies for entertainment, others turned to more humble forms of survival that would become iconic symbols of the Depression era. The sight of men in worn suits standing on busy street corners selling apples became as synonymous with the 1930s as breadlines and Hoovervilles. The apple vendor phenomenon began as a well-intentioned relief initiative that quickly spiraled into something more complex and tragic. The International Apple Shippers Association, facing their own economic difficulties, devised a plan that seemed to benefit everyone involved. They would sell boxes of 88 apples to unemployed workers at a reduced cost of $1.75 per box, allowing these new vendors to resell individual apples on street corners for 5 cents each. On paper, the math looked promising, offering the potential for modest but meaningful income to desperate families. Initially, the program seemed like a remarkable success story. Sympathetic city dwellers, moved by the sight of formerly middle-class professionals reduced to hawking fruit, often paid far more than the asking price for a single apple. Some customers handed over quarters or even dollar bills for apples worth a nickel, treating the transaction as disguised charity that allowed both parties to maintain their dignity. During those first few weeks, vendors reported earnings that could actually support a family, and the program expanded rapidly across major American cities. But success bred its own destruction. As word spread about the apple-selling opportunity, unemployed workers flooded street corners with wooden crates and handwritten signs. What had been a novel sight became commonplace, then overwhelming. Street corners that once hosted a single vendor now featured 3 or 4 competing apple sellers within a single block. The sympathetic buyers who had initially driven profits were quickly exhausted, and vendors found themselves competing for an increasingly indifferent customer base. The economics of oversupply hit hard and fast. Where early vendors had enjoyed windfall purchases from generous customers, later arrivals discovered that most people would pass by entirely rather than buy overpriced fruit they didn't particularly want. Profit margins collapsed from promising returns to barely a penny per apple after accounting for the cost of the fruit, transportation, and hours spent standing in all-weather conditions. Many vendors found themselves earning less than they had spent on their initial inventory. As the apple market became saturated and profits evaporated, vendors began diversifying into other street corner hustles. Some transitioned to shoe shine services, carrying small wooden boxes and offering to clean the shoes of passers-by for a few cents. Others became human billboards, wearing sandwich board signs that advertised local businesses, restaurants offering cheap meals, or services targeted at other desperate Americans. The sandwich men, as they became known, walked prescribed routes through busy commercial districts, their front and back advertising boards making them walking testimonials to economic desperation. The human billboard phenomenon had roots stretching back to the 19th century, but the Depression gave it new prominence and darker significance. These weren't quirky marketing stunts, but survival strategies for men who had exhausted other options. The pay was minimal, often just enough for a single meal, and the work carried profound social stigma. Well-dressed pedestrians would avoid eye contact with sandwich men, treating them as part of the urban landscape rather than fellow human beings. By the middle of the decade, the novelty of buying apples from street vendors had completely worn off, and competition had driven most vendors out of the business entirely. The brief window when sympathy purchases could support a family had closed, leaving behind only the memory of men in increasingly shabby clothes standing beside rapidly shrinking piles of fruit that few people wanted to buy. The desperation that drove adults to dance until they collapsed or sell apples on street corners also normalized something even more disturbing, putting children in harm's way for a few dollars a week. In bowling alleys across America, boys as young as 10 years old spent their evenings dodging 16-pound bowling balls, traveling at dangerous speeds, all for the privilege of earning pocket change in one of the era's most hazardous occupations. Before the advent of automatic pin setters, every bowling alley required human workers to manually reset pins after each frame. These pin boys, sometimes called pin monkeys in the cruder parlance of the day, perched precariously behind the lanes in cramped spaces barely large enough for a child to crouch. When bowlers released their balls, these young workers had seconds to clear fallen pins, reset the remaining ones in perfect formation, and return the ball via an underground track system before the next throw came hurtling toward them. The physics of the job was terrifying. A bowling ball could reach speeds of 20 miles per hour or more by the time it struck the pins, sending wooden pins flying in unpredictable directions with enough force to break bones. Pin boys developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate where pins would scatter, but even the most experienced workers couldn't avoid every projectile. Bruises were so common, they became an expected part of the job, worn like badges of honor among the boys who competed for shifts at busy urban alleys. More serious injuries were disturbingly routine. Hospital records from the era document countless cases of pin boys suffering fractured ribs, broken arms, and severe head trauma from direct hits by bowling balls or flying pins. Some boys lost teeth when pins struck them in the face. Others suffered permanent hearing damage from the constant crash of balls and pins in enclosed spaces. The most unfortunate victims endured spinal injuries that left them permanently disabled, their brief careers as pin boys ending in wheelchairs or worse. The working conditions extended beyond physical danger into pure exploitation. Pin boys typically worked from late afternoon until well past midnight, often on school nights, earning perhaps 50 cents for a full shift of constant physical stress and mortal peril. Busy alleys could host dozens of games simultaneously, meaning a single pin boy might reset hundreds of frames per night while maintaining the lightning-fast pace that kept customers satisfied and profits flowing. The alley owners showed little concern for worker safety, viewing pin boys as easily replaceable components in their business operations. No safety equipment was provided, no medical insurance covered injuries, and boys who couldn't maintain the required speed were simply fired and replaced by other desperate children whose families needed every penny they could earn. What made this child labor particularly insidious was how completely normalized it became in Depression-era society. Parents who would never have considered sending their children into coal mines or textile factories readily allowed them to work in bowling alleys because the environment seemed recreational rather than industrial. The presence of laughing customers and the association with leisure activities masked the very real dangers that children faced every night they reported for work. But child labor wasn't the only area where the Depression normalized dangerous working conditions that would seem unthinkable today. The era's economic desperation also sustained entire occupations built around physical demands that regularly destroyed workers' bodies, all for jobs that advancing technology would soon make completely obsolete. Ice delivery represented one of the most punishing forms of manual labor that ordinary Americans performed during the Depression. Before electric refrigeration became affordable and widespread, most households relied on ice boxes that required regular deliveries of massive ice blocks to keep food from spoiling. This created steady work for ice delivery men, but the job demanded a level of physical strength and endurance that broke down even the strongest workers within a few years. The typical ice route began before dawn at refrigeration plants, where workers loaded trucks with blocks weighing between 50 and 100 pounds each. Using metal tongs and leather shoulder pads, delivery men hoisted these frozen monuments onto their backs and carried them up multiple flights of stairs to apartment ice boxes. A single delivery could require climbing 4 or 5 stories while balancing a a 100-pound block of ice that grew increasingly slippery as it began to melt. Back injuries were virtually guaranteed for anyone who worked ice delivery for more than a few months. The combination of extreme weight, awkward positioning, and repetitive lifting movements created the perfect conditions for herniated discs, torn muscles, and permanent spinal damage. Many delivery men developed distinctive stooped postures from years of carrying ice blocks, their bodies permanently curved by the weight they had shouldered. Some could barely walk by age 40, their earning years cut short by the physical demands of a job that seemed straightforward but proved devastating. The economics of ice delivery trapped workers in a cycle of physical destruction. Pay was calculated per delivery, incentivizing speed over safety and encouraging workers to take dangerous shortcuts that multiplied injury risks. Customers expected prompt service regardless of weather conditions, and delivery companies fired workers who couldn't maintain their routes due to injuries. The most successful icemen were those who could temporarily ignore pain and push through injuries that would have sidelined workers in less demanding occupations. Yet ice delivery seemed luxurious compared to one of the era's most unusual occupations that thrived in industrial Britain and found scattered adoption in American factory towns. The knocker-upper represented perhaps the most essential yet precarious job of the pre-electronic age, serving as a human alarm clock for workers who couldn't afford reliable timepieces but faced unemployment or worse if they arrived late to factory shifts. These human alarm clocks worked in the darkness before dawn, carrying long wooden poles or employing pea shooters to tap on bedroom windows of paying customers who needed to wake up for early industrial shifts. The job required precise timing, intimate knowledge of neighborhood layouts, and the ability to rouse sleeping workers without disturbing their neighbors or attracting police attention. Knocker-uppers typically charged a few pennies per week for their services, creating modest but steady income streams that could support families when other work was scarce. The physical demands of being a human alarm clock were more severe than they initially appeared. Knocker-uppers worked in all weather conditions, walking miles through dark streets while carrying poles that could be 12 feet long or longer. Winter mornings required navigating icy sidewalks while manipulating unwieldy equipment. Rain soaked workers to the skin during their most active hours when few businesses were open to provide shelter. The work was inherently dangerous, as pre-dawn streets harbored both criminal elements and suspicious police officers who might mistake legitimate knocker-uppers for burglars or vagrants. The social dynamics of the occupation created additional complications. Knocker-uppers needed to maintain relationships with dozens of customers whose livelihoods depended on punctual service, but they also had to avoid becoming too familiar with households where they witnessed private domestic situations during vulnerable early morning hours. Failed wake-up calls could cost customers their jobs, creating enormous pressure on knocker-uppers to perform flawlessly regardless of personal illness or family emergencies. While some Depression-era jobs destroyed bodies through physical labor, others created unexpected spaces for culture and community in the most unlikely settings. In cigar factories across America, workers pooled their meager wages to hire lectors, professional readers who transformed monotonous, hand-rolling shifts into literary salons that would shape both culture and politics on the shop floor. These factory readers represented one of the most sophisticated examples of worker-controlled education in American industrial history, until management decided that an informed workforce posed too great a threat to accept. The tradition of factory lectors had deep roots in Cuban tobacco culture, brought to American shores by immigrant workers who understood that mental stimulation could make physical labor bearable. Cigar rolling required steady hands and focused attention, but left the mind free to wander, creating perfect conditions for communal listening. Workers contributed small portions of their weekly earnings to hire educated men who would read newspapers, novels, and political treatises aloud from elevated platforms positioned throughout the factory floor. What made lectors extraordinary wasn't just their ability to entertain workers, but their power to educate and politicize entire communities through carefully chosen reading material. A typical day might begin with newspaper reports about national politics, transition to chapters from Charles Dickens or Émile Zola, and conclude with readings from labor publications or socialist texts that analyzed the very conditions workers experienced in their daily lives. The selection process was democratic, with workers voting on which books and articles they wanted to hear, creating a curriculum that reflected their interests and concerns rather than management's preferences. But the educational power that made lectors valuable to workers also made them dangerous to factory owners, particularly during periods of labor unrest. When lectors read about workplace organizing or social justice movements, they weren't just providing entertainment, but actively shaping how workers understood their relationship to capital and power. The combination of shared listening experiences and collective work created solidarity that management found increasingly threatening as economic pressures intensified during the Depression. The conflict came to a head during a series of strikes in the early 1930s when factory owners identified lectors as sources of worker radicalization. Management argued that readings from labor publications and political texts were inciting unrest and making workers less compliant with factory discipline. Some owners tried to control the curriculum by approving reading materials in advance, but workers resisted these efforts as violations of their collectively bargained cultural autonomy. The resolution was swift and decisive. During major labor disputes, factory owners simply eliminated lector positions entirely, replacing them with radios that provided music and news, but eliminated the educational component that had made the tradition valuable to workers. The transition from human readers to mechanical entertainment represented more than just technological advancement, but a deliberate effort to reduce worker consciousness and political engagement. Within a few years, one of America's most distinctive forms of workplace culture had virtually disappeared, leaving behind only memories of a time when factory floors had served as centers of learning and political discussion. The loss of lectors marked the end of an era when workers had successfully claimed intellectual space within industrial settings. The tradition had demonstrated that even the most repetitive labor could accommodate sophisticated cultural programming when workers organized collectively to create and fund their own educational experiences. But it also revealed the limits of worker autonomy when cultural activities began to challenge the fundamental power relationships that governed industrial production. Yet not all Depression-era cultural workers operated within industrial settings or faced direct management opposition. In drugstores across America, soda jerks created their own form of community theater, transforming mundane beverage service into elaborate performances that helped sustain social connections during the era's darkest economic moments. These fountain clerks became unlikely cultural ambassadors, using flair, humor, and theatrical mixing techniques to create gathering spaces that provided much-needed social interaction for isolated and struggling communities. The golden age of soda fountains coincided perfectly with Prohibition and the early Depression, when affordable entertainment was scarce and alcohol was illegal. Drugstore soda fountains filled the social void left by closed saloons, offering inexpensive treats and non-alcoholic beverages that could justify spending time in friendly, well-lit spaces. Soda jerks understood that they weren't just mixing drinks, but facilitating social interactions that might be the highlight of customers' otherwise difficult days. The performance aspect of soda jerking elevated simple beverage preparation into entertainment spectacle. Skilled fountain clerks developed elaborate routines for mixing ice cream sodas and sundaes, using exaggerated gestures and theatrical timing to transform functional tasks into shows. The best soda jerks could spin mixing spoons like batons, create towering whipped cream sculptures, and engage multiple customers simultaneously with running commentary that kept everyone laughing and feeling included in the fountain's temporary community. The economic model that sustained soda jerks depended on volume rather than individual transaction size, creating incentives for fountain clerks to build customer loyalty through memorable experiences rather than expensive purchases. Regular customers developed relationships with specific soda jerks, creating informal communities centered around shared experiences and running conversations that continued across multiple visits. These relationships provided emotional support networks that helped sustain people through the psychological challenges of economic hardship. But the cultural significance of soda jerks extended beyond individual customer service into broader community functions. Fountain clerks served as informal news distributors, gossip coordinators, and social connectors who helped maintain neighborhood cohesion during periods when other community institutions were struggling. They knew which customers were looking for work, which families needed assistance, and which local businesses were hiring, making soda fountains into unofficial employment and social service centers. While cultural workers like lectors and soda jerks created community through private employment, the federal government's response to depression unemployment included programs that generated entirely new categories of public service jobs, some of which placed workers in conditions of isolation and danger that would be unacceptable in modern employment. The Civilian Conservation Corps created opportunities for unemployed young men to earn wages through conservation work, but many of these positions required levels of solitude and risk that tested the psychological and physical limits of even the hardiest workers. Fire lookout observers represented the most extreme example of government-created employment that prioritized conservation needs over worker welfare. Stationed alone in towers constructed on remote mountain peaks, these federal employees spent months at a time scanning vast wilderness areas for the first signs of smoke that might indicate developing forest fires. The work required constant vigilance during daylight hours, with observers using telescopes and radio equipment to monitor territories covering hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain. The psychological demands of fire lookout duty were as challenging as the physical dangers. Observers typically worked alone for weeks or months without direct human contact, communicating only through radio transmissions with distant supervisors who might be dozens of miles away. The combination of isolation, responsibility, and environmental stress created conditions that broke down many workers within their first seasons. Some observers reported hallucinations, depression, and anxiety disorders that persisted long after their tower assignments ended. Lightning represented the most immediate and terrifying occupational hazard for fire lookouts. Towers were deliberately positioned on the highest available elevations to maximize visibility, making them natural lightning targets during the summer thunderstorms that were most likely to spark forest fires. Observers had to balance their duty to watch for fire signs against the need to seek shelter when electrical storms approached their positions. Many towers were struck repeatedly during single storm seasons, killing or injuring observers who couldn't abandon their posts quickly enough. The physical isolation of lookout duty created additional safety challenges that multiplied the risks of what was already dangerous work. Medical emergencies that would be minor inconveniences in populated areas became life-threatening situations when the nearest hospital was days away by foot through wilderness terrain. Observers who suffered injuries, illnesses, or equipment failures faced the prospect of death from exposure or dehydration while waiting for rescue teams that might not realize they were in trouble for weeks. Yet the federal government continued expanding fire lookout programs throughout the Depression because they served multiple political purposes beyond forest protection. The positions provided employment for young men who might otherwise become sources of social unrest, removing them from urban areas where unemployment was most visible and politically problematic. The conservation work generated favorable publicity for New Deal programs while advancing legitimate environmental protection goals that enjoyed broad public support. The human cost of these employment programs was rarely calculated or acknowledged in official reports. Observers who developed psychological problems from extended isolation were quietly transferred to other assignments or released from service without compensation for disabilities incurred during their government employment. Families of observers killed by lightning or other occupational hazards received minimal death benefits that reflected the era's casual attitude toward worker safety in dangerous occupations. But not all Depression-era innovation in employment came from government programs or formal business enterprises. In urban communities hit hardest by economic collapse, residents developed informal economic strategies that created entirely new categories of cultural work based on community cooperation and shared survival needs. Rent parties in Harlem represented perhaps the most creative example of Depression-era social entrepreneurship, transforming private apartments into temporary entertainment venues that generated income for struggling tenants while providing affordable recreation for neighbors facing similar economic challenges. The rent party phenomenon emerged from simple economic necessity. When unemployment eliminated regular income, but landlords continued demanding monthly payments, tenants faced eviction unless they could find alternative revenue sources. Enterprising apartment dwellers discovered that they could generate enough money to cover rent by hosting weekend parties that charge modest admission fees for music, dancing, and refreshments. The model was elegant in its simplicity. Hire musicians for a few dollars, buy cheap alcohol and snacks, charge visitors 25 or 50 cents for entry, and hope that attendance would generate enough profit to satisfy the landlord. What made rent parties culturally significant was how they transformed economic desperation into artistic innovation. Party hosts competed to provide the best entertainment and atmosphere, leading to increasingly sophisticated musical programming that featured emerging jazz artists who would later become legendary performers. The informal venues provided stages for musicians who couldn't afford to rent proper performance spaces, creating opportunities for artistic development that might not have existed through conventional commercial channels. The social networks that developed around rent parties created community support systems that extended far beyond individual entertainment events. Regular party attendees formed relationships that provided mutual assistance during economic emergencies, job referrals, and emotional support that helped people survive the psychological challenges of prolonged unemployment and poverty. But rent parties also operated in legal gray areas that exposed both hosts and attendees to police scrutiny and potential prosecution. Selling alcohol without licenses violated numerous municipal regulations, and the noise and crowds associated with successful parties often attracted unwanted official attention. Some landlords supported rent parties because they ensured timely payment, while others used party activity as justification for eviction proceedings that allowed them to rent apartments to more financially stable tenants. The end of rent party culture came gradually as economic recovery provided more conventional employment opportunities and changing housing conditions reduced the desperate need for alternative income sources. The informal networks that had sustained these events dispersed as participants found steady work and moved to different neighborhoods. By mid-century, rent parties had largely disappeared from American urban culture, remembered mainly through the artifacts collected by writers and photographers who recognized their historical significance while they were still happening.